There are places on this earth that sleep under a certain kind of certainty. The slow, predictable rhythm of tides, the motion of seasons, the small routines that mark a people's life. For generations, the village of Caracas had been one of those places. Tucked into a green basin between low ridges of limestone, its narrow streets sloped gently down toward a single, silver sheet of water that the villagers called simply the lake. It was not a grand or famous lake. It had no official name on old maps, no tourists to clog its shores. Yet for everyone who lived there, it was the center of daily life. Fishermen measured their months by the catch. Mothers washed linens along the shallow banks. Children learned to skip stones and to keep clear of the deeper holes that lurked near the reeds. Lovers swore oaths beneath the same willow trees. And every morning, without fail, the village woke to the lake's quiet reflection. That morning began like any other. A cool mist hovered at dawn, and roosters crowed from the rows of long-roofed houses. Dogs padded between yards. Smoke from wood fires curled up into a pale sky. The first person to notice that something was wrong was Mehmet, an old man whose boat had been patched so many times it creaked with memory. He had gone to the shore to check the nets, as he always did, carrying the thermos his wife insisted he must take. He stopped at the edge and frowned. At first he thought it was the fog. The surface of the lake, usually a placid plain of grey-blue, had small, fast-moving rings in places where the water should have been smooth. Little spirals like tiny whirlpools, as if something below were turning. And each ring widened slowly, swallowing more of the surface. Mehmet called for the other fishermen. Within an hour, several boats clustered where the rings formed. They leaned over the gunwales and peered into water that reflected a roiling, uncertain sky. "There's a pull," one man whispered, the kind of startled voice people use when they are not sure whether they have seen a miracle or a curse. The rings grew, the water's edge sighed and fell away in thin lines. A few reeds went under, then whole tufts slid toward darker openings. The first nets were torn as if an invisible hand dragged them through a raised current. Children who came to watch shouted in surprise. Chairs were overturned. Dogs barked until their voices broke. News, in villages like this, travels by eye and by mouth. By 9 o'clock, the whole community had spilled out onto the banks, a living ring of faces, watching their life liquid vanish. People filmed on phones they seldom used. Some made the sign of the cross. Others struck bargains with gods they had not remembered to pray to for years. A local teacher, who liked neat explanations, called the county office. An amateur radio operator spun a wheel and sent a message to the university, a place 3 valleys away, where a handful of geologists and hydrologists had lab space and long, patient notebooks. Within hours, vehicles arrived, white trucks with names on their doors, men with the kind of clipboards that mean the world is to be measured. When scientists crouched at the cracked edge and pointed their instruments, an older woman stepped forward. Her name was Aylin, and she had lived by the lake since she was a child. She held a rusted ladle in her hands and said slowly, "My grandfather used to tell us not to anger water. He said water remembers." Her voice was the kind that carries decades of weather. People laughed nervously. But what the scientists found did not entirely contradict old tales. The ground at the lake's bottom had shifted in ways that could not be explained by a gentle season. Instruments recorded sudden subsidence, the slow, terrifying sinking of voids beneath the lakebed, and readings suggested the presence of cavities vast enough to devour the lake's volume. Yet those scientific readings left one raw sensation that data could not soften: the speed. The lake did not drain over weeks or months. It surged, gurgled, and in a matter of hours the smooth mirror had become a yawning basin. Caracas' history was made of small stories, bargains, births, stolen apples, but the lake had its own archive as well. In winter, the reflection changes, elders loved to say. In drought years, the reeds lean farther out. There were songs about storms and quiet oaths against wasting water. A local chronicle kept in the school's single plastic folder recalled that the basin had once been deeper than memory, and older than that, maps hinted at a shifting coastline of the land itself. The lake had fed the village, and when it was generous, it taught patience. So when it started disappearing, the village felt the loss like a limb gone numb. The future became tentative, a question without a clear answer. By mid-morning, the lake had lost more than a third of its surface. What had been a wide blue curve was now a shallow moat lined with mud. Boats lay in a new posture, beached on slick banks, their keels high and ridiculous. Fishermen attempted to push them deeper, and failed. Eyes that had looked at the water for decades found themselves looking at a new geography, a floor of the lake exposed like the innards of a story. Witnesses came forward with details only someone who slept in the shadow of a place could know. A shepherd named Erkan told how his goat, startled by an unusual rumble, leapt from a ledge and later returned with a smear of black, greasy silt on its hooves. A teacher brought a notebook of old village tales that spoke of caverns beneath the basin, of voices that carried in winter, and of a spring that once sighed. A woman who sold bread and knew the timetables of the market reported that fish that had never been seen in the lake were suddenly flopping in shallow pools, some with their mouths still full of mud. The county's geology team arrived with slow competence. Their lead, a man named Dr. Ozan, mapped fissures and drove ground-penetrating radar along the margins. He explained to the crowd in patient sentences that the limestone beneath the area is soluble, that rain and stream water, seeping through microfractures for centuries, dissolve the stone and create subterranean caverns. One day, those caverns can no longer support the overlying strata. The roof collapses and the world above follows, as if an entire cellar had been swallowed. That can drain a lake, he said, but not always this quickly. The rate depends on the connectivity of caves, on sudden pressure changes, and on fractures that might night by night widen until the structure fails. He pointed at a cluster of dark cracks and said the word sinkhole more as a term than a metaphor. A sinkhole, the people learned that day, is not a single, neat collapse. It might be the call and the effect of many hidden processes working at once. The journalist who had come to cover the event wrote the word in headlines that made the villagers feel both strange and oddly seen. Alongside the technical explanation, odd pieces of evidence multiplied. At dawn, a farmer claimed he had heard hours earlier a kind of choking, deep thunder under the soil. A child came forward with a drawing of the lake and dark lines emanating from its center. His way of making sense, scribbles turned meaning. A few elderly fishermen said that the birds had left the morning before the whirlpools appeared. Others remembered faint foamy scum that smelled of iron. The combination of small observations made a larger mosaic. The event had not been sudden to everyone. Something had shifted in the days preceding the visible collapse. As scientists took measurements, the village council briefly convened at the school. They argued about evacuation routes and compensation for lost livelihoods. A local official, new and anxious about his re-election, insisted on a measured statement. Religious figures called for calm and prayer. Women with aprons still round their waists handed out tea and wrapped bread for those waiting in the cold, a practical tenderness in a chaotic hour. The larger world, too, took an interest. A university from the capital sent a remote sensing team. Our television station ran the footage on loop, the hour when water seemed to sink into the ground like a swallowed breath. And yet the most persistent explanation, in whispers and in the clack of chai glasses, blended the scientific with the ancient. The lake had, some said, been a shrine. It had weathered wars and droughts, and over ages it had taken on stories. Where science saw cavities and limestone chemistry, people saw the memory of lives and the presence of an old covenant breached. In the corners of cafes and under the willows, the line between the two explanations blurred. People repeated the same phrase. Nature had its own language, and sometimes it spoke in silence. Over the following days, investigators lowered cameras into dark shafts and poured dye into small tributaries to trace where water might reappear. But the dye vanished. Instruments recorded continuities and strains. Satellite imagery showed an astonishing pattern, a network of darker lines like veins, running away from the basin as if the earth itself had been rerouted. Hydrologists argued that the water could have gone into a system of karst conduits, fast-moving underground streams that vanish and re-emerge miles away. Geophysicists debated whether a sudden pressure event, perhaps linked to groundwater extraction or seismic micro-events, had triggered a catastrophic opening. One scientist even suggested that an ancient, previously unknown conduit had been exposed, a plumbing of the earth that no human eyes had mapped, and that, when opened, took what it could. Meanwhile, normal life bent around the new fact of an absent lake. The farmers who once irrigated their fields by drawing from its shallow springs found pipes thin with silt. A lane that led to the market, now funneled, stared visitors and scientists. Children played a strange new game of balancing on the cracked rim and dared each other to jump across fissures that, in their imagination, looked like the mouths of sleeping gods. The village's economy shuddered. The anglers who once shared the Lake Ass' modest bounty now faced the prospect of a winter with empty nets. There were also darker consequences. With the lake gone, water that once circulated and diluted waste now pooled in stagnant hollows, and the smell of rot began to creep into the settlement. Mosquitoes multiplied where the shallows lingered, and a veterinarian warned of the risk of animals exposed to contaminated mud. The drama of a vanished lake, which had at first been a spectacle of fear and wonder, sharpened into a slow series of hardships. As the first month passed, the scientific teams worked in shifts, their equipment piling like a temporary small city on the rim of the basin. Drones skimmed across the empty floor, dropping sensors and taking thermal readings. Seismometers near the cracked soil recorded tiny, spidery vibrations that suggested microfractures were settling or widening. Yet for every instrument that suggested a plausible cause, new puzzles emerged. One of the most troubling anomalies was the missing water itself. When large volumes move underground through karst systems, they usually reappear in springs, rivers, or emerge into other basins. But none of the nearby rivers showed a spike in flow, and springs that had been perennial were not noticeably enriched. Teams followed hydrological models and came up with possible pathways, long and convoluted, yet they could not trace the water to any single convincing endpoint. Dye traces injected into the fissures lost coherence quickly. The dye diluted and vanished in patterns that frustrated the logics of the models. Complicating matters were a series of remarkably local climatic events prior to the collapse. An extended period of unusual rainfall, followed by a sharp dry spell, had created cycles of saturation and tensile stress across the limestone. Some experts suggested that these cycles could have accelerated underground dissolutions of stone, creating a threshold effect. Imagine a bridge worn surprisingly thin at its midpoint. One small additional load, and it yields. But these were only models and metaphors. They could suggest tendencies but could not soothe the villagers who returned daily to stare into the empty basin. Then came the reports of strange sounds. Their family living on the rim said they had heard a low harmonic resonance days before the disappearance, a sound like a distant bell or like the earth itself humming with a long, thin note. Others reported flashes of pale light in the cracks at night. People with religious frames read these phenomena as portents. Others were more pragmatic, wondering whether methane seepage or electrochemical reactions might explain the glows. Investigators took measurements for gases and increased their monitoring for geochemical anomalies. In the second month, an amateur diver from another region attempted something that most people agreed to avoid. He descended into one of the newly exposed fissures in a risky, unauthorized attempt to follow where the lake water might have gone. His action was part bravado and part curiosity, and it ended in tragedy. He surfaced hours later, emaciated and clearly traumatized, with a story he could barely say aloud. He spoke of a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber with stale air and a faint current. He said he had followed the sound of moving water for a time, but then the passage grew too tight, the current harder to fight, and he had to retreat. He claimed he had seen pale, flaking deposits on the walls, and in the dimness he thought he saw shapes in the distance, not living things but outlines of a place that had been shaped by water for ages. The diver's account electrified social media. It gave the mystery an almost cinematic arc. Man enters the mouth of the earth and returns with the knowledge of its hollows. Speculation accelerated. Conspiracy theories flared. Some claimed government teams were hiding the real reason for the disappearance: secret mining tunnels, illicit waste disposal, even military testing. The official teams, already defensive, faced pressure to be transparent and to demonstrate their competence. The university scientists published raw data, hoping that openness would ward off rumor. Yet the more information they released, the more others read motives into the gaps. Economically, the village's situation worsened. Tourists who had once come for the quiet views turned away in droves. Officials closed the edge to prevent accidents, and insurance claims slowly stacked up. Young people left for the city to find work. Some houses that no longer housed fishermen's livelihoods fell into neglect. In the market hall, conversations dried into lists: what to seed in the spring, where to find water for livestock, how to care for a pond that no longer existed. There was also a moral crisis. The disappearance forced some to face uncomfortable choices. A company a short drive away offered to sink boreholes and provide pumped water to the village for a price. The council debated whether to accept a private pipeline. Some villagers saw in the offer salvation, water that would return life to gardens and ponds. Others saw dependence and the risk of exploitation. The dispute became heated because the loss of the lake was not just physical, it was existential. To accept water as a commodity, they argued, might be to admit that the old commons of water had been irreparably altered. And still, the question of where the water went persisted like a raw wound. Scientists refined their models and published tentative maps of subterranean passages. They proved, with a cautious confidence, that major conduits existed and that water flow could be preferentially channeled during particular pressure differentials. Yet the clear, satisfying narrative, the neat "here it went, here is where it now flows," remained elusive. For every plausible map drawn, there was a counterexample: a spring that had not been fed, a river whose level did not rise. The missing water had become an absence that would not be filled by data alone. Years after that morning, Caracas had changed its routine. The rim of the empty basin was still cordoned, though the tape of caution sagged in places, and small plaques had been placed by volunteers telling the story in a few neat, tourist-friendly lines. People came to look, sometimes for reasons of science, sometimes for reasons of sorrow. Children who had been small at the time grew up with an image of the cracked basin in their first memory, a hollow in the landscape that told them the world could alter without consultation. The scientists kept working in fits. A long-term monitoring program tracked subtle movements in the crust. A series of small interventions tried to stabilize some of the nearest fissures. A few springs miles away showed minute changes over seasons. Hydrologists argued over whether those were echoes of the event or mundane fluctuations. Some data suggested that small amounts of lake water had indeed rerouted into hidden channels and mixed with groundwater hundreds of meters from where it had once been. In other words, the water had not been annihilated. It had moved and diffused into places and times that did not fit the village's immediate sense of return. Culturally, the lake's absence produced new expressions. Local poets wrote verses about a mirror lost. The school taught a unit on karst geology next to the old reading of the village chronicles. Songs were sung about the willow by the shore and about the mysterious hollow where the children once dared each other. The story of the vanished lake became a kind of modern fable, a lesson about humility, about infrastructural fragility, about the limits of human certainty. Internationally, the event came to be read as a cautionary case study. Environmental planners used it in university curricula about groundwater and risk. It showed that a local, apparently isolated landscape could hold surprises of a magnitude that defy quick fixes. Engineers and policymakers in city halls and global conferences used Caracas to argue for more cautious groundwater management, for mapping hidden karst systems, for investing in early warning sensors in vulnerable regions. But in the human terms that mattered most to the villagers, the lesson remained less tidy. We woke up and the lake was no longer there, people still said, and the simplicity of the sentence captured a truth science and policy could not fully explain: the experience of living with a sudden, irreversible change. For some, the lake's absence was a wound. For others, it became a new space, one that could be planted or memorialized. For the children who had grown into adults, it was the place where they had first learned fear and the feeling of things being fragile. As with many mysteries, what the experts could not answer held a particular power. The fact that the water could move into the earth and vanish to human instruments made people think about time at a different scale. For centuries, water had traced curves on the land. One morning, without dramatic fanfare, it rewrote local history. So what does this story leave us with? It leaves a cracked basin and the human stories that orbit that absence: anger, grief, curiosity, and wonder. It leaves scientists peering into data and people peering into the void, both seeking a narrative that accounts for what happened. It leaves a question. How well do we truly know the ground beneath our feet? If this story moved you, if it stirred the part of you that wonders about the hidden networks beneath familiar places, tell us what you think in the comments. Have you ever witnessed something that made the ordinary world seem strange? Share your experience, your voice becomes part of the record. And while you're here, consider liking and subscribing. It helps us keep telling these strange and important stories.